Hi, Dan Luce again. We are ready for lecture 4. And in this lecture we want to talk about the development of the English Bible. The Bible first appeared in English, at least a complete Bible, in 1382. And this was the Wickliffe version of the Bible. But it should be noted that various parts of the Bible had already been available to even Anglo-Saxons at a much earlier period than the Wickliffe version. If you go back far enough, you actually find some of the stories of the Bible and some of the songs of the Bible rendered in the 7th century by a poet by the name of Caedmon. The Venerable Bede, which was up in the northern part of England, just below the Scottish border, translated most all of the Gospel of John by 735 AD. Alfred the Great, one of the kings in the southern part of England, encouraged the translation of things like the Ten Commandments and the Psalms, and in fact there were paraphrases of the Gospels, and these were made by around 950. The Lindisfarne Gospels offered an interlinear translation in the Northumbrian dialect. They started with a Latin text, which had the Latin Vulgate, but then in between the lines of the Latin text, they wrote their own translation in the Anglo-Saxon of the time, and this was done in about the mid-10th century. So even well before John Wickliffe made the first full English translation of the Bible, there were translations of parts of the Bible already in existence. Also by the middle of the 10th century, what were called the Wessex Gospels appeared. These were in Old English. And of course, English is itself in a developmental stage. By the time you get to the 11th century and the Norman Conquest, there are elements of language coming into England from the continent, and so English has begun to change. And all of these kinds of changes mean that new translation work needs to be done. Such translation work is from such an early period that most people trying to read one of these very early translations would find it very, very difficult. I've reproduced for you here on this slide the text in Matthew 13 verses 3 through 6, which dates to about 1000 AD. And I would guess that most English readers would have difficulty, in fact probably great difficulty, in trying to read this text. If you already know it's from Matthew 13 and the parable of the sower, you probably would be able to guess what certain words mean because they sound a little bit like what you might be used to seeing in modern English. But for the most part, this is a very difficult text. And English, of course, changes over the years. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the Norman Conquest in 1066 brought new elements into the language, and Anglo-Saxon as a language began to fade, and the Normans didn't speak Anglo-Saxon, and so the British Isles were now shifting toward what is called Middle English. John Wickliffe of Oxford University, assisted by some of his friends, decided that they needed a new translation of the Bible into Middle English. And so they began this translation in 1382, and it was completed a few years later. There was a disadvantage, however, and that is that John Wickliffe was not working from a Greek text for the New Testament or a Hebrew text from the Old Testament. Rather, he was working from the Latin text that had been translated by St. Jerome many centuries earlier. And so in essence then, John Wycliffe's version, although it was very valuable, it was a translation of a translation. And so 2 steps removed from the original text of Scripture. Here is an image of one of the pages of John Wycliffe's version. This is a pocket, basically a pocket edition, pocket size, and it was probably used by a traveling preacher, sometimes called the Lollards, who were followers of John Wickliffe. By the time of the Protestant Reformation, those who had adopted Protestant ideas began to think very seriously about the importance of translating the Bible into the vernacular of the common person. And so this is a primary concern of the Reformers, that the Scriptures are available in the common tongue, in English. With the revival of the study of classical languages, access to Greek manuscripts, access to Hebrew manuscripts is now much wider than it used to be in earlier times. The Reformation ideal that Scripture is the central Christian authority, or as they would express it in a very short term, Scripture alone, made the desire for accurate translations a very high priority for the Reformers. In Germany, Luther began to translate the Bible into German, and other reformers translated the Bible into other languages. In England, a very important translation began to take place, which was the translation of William Tyndale. One of the important technical advances in this time that made this a much more doable project was the invention of the printing press. Prior to Gutenberg and the introduction of movable type, texts were copied one text at a time, one letter at a time. But the technical advantage of printing meant that you could actually print whole pages at a time, eventually whole books at a time, and this of course made the availability of the translation of the Bible much more widely accessible. William Tyndale, who lived in the late 15th century and early 16th century, worked in England on to translate the Bible into English. But because it was at that time, believe it or not, against the law to do this, he found it necessary to move over the channel to the continent and to continue to translate the Bible there into English. His translations then were printed and they were shipped back to England in basically as smuggled items in grain bags and other kinds of commercial items where there were favorable merchants who would do this for him. Unlike the Wickliffe version, Tyndale's translation was directly from the languages of Greek and Hebrew, and Tyndale was very well versed in New Testament Greek and Old Testament Hebrew. So even though he faced very harsh opposition, he continued his work, often on the run. In fact, according to what few records we have, sometimes Tyndale was slipping out the back door while the authorities were coming in the front door, and under his arm were his manuscripts and his pages. And from various places he went, from place to place, trying to translate the Bible. In fact, on one occasion he actually said to a priest, he said, "If God gives me time, the plowboy will know more about the Bible than you do." And he was doing his very best to make that possible. In the end, Tyndale's work earned him a martyrdom. The authorities finally caught up with him, and he was burned at the stake. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "God, open the eyes of the King of England." This image shows a copy of Tyndale's version. You can look at it, and as you look at it, the lettering, of course, is in an older English style. But it is a lot more readable than the one that we looked at earlier from the Wessex Gospels. This one isn't particularly easy to read, but it is at least easier. You can have a look at this. This little Bible was probably smuggled into England in a grain sack. One of the ironies is that the authorities decided, since Tyndale was smuggling the Bibles into England, that they would try to buy them all up on the black market and get rid of them. So they did. They bought as many as they could, and they burned them and they destroyed them. The irony is that the money that they bought those Bibles with was all turned over back to Tyndale on the continent, and he continued to use them to print more Bibles. So in essence, they were actually funding his Bible translation effort, even though they were unaware of it. Other English translations, early ones, include some of these. There's what is called the Miles Coverdale version in 1535. The Thomas Matthews version in 1537, the Great Bible in 1539, the Geneva Bible in 1560, and the Geneva Bible had the interesting feature that it contained a lot of theological footnotes, most of them in the interest of Calvinism. The Bishop's Bible, 1568, and then eventually there was the Roman Catholic Douay version of the Bible in the early 17th century. The one that eclipses them all, of course, is what is called the King James Version of the Bible. Now, the King James Version is by no means the earliest translation in English, but it is a very important translation in English because it sort of holds the center court for about 3 centuries. In 1604, King James of England ordered a production of a new version, and he ordered that they should compare this version with the Greek and Hebrew texts of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The scholars that were used began with the Bishop's Bible as the starting point, but they had available to them these various other English translations, especially William Tyndale's. And there is a large part of the New Testament that really is pretty much a reproduction of William Tyndale's work. The King James Version was finished in 1611, although it took quite a while for it to be accepted. It may be hard for us to realize this, but at one time the King James Version was the new translation. and not everybody was enthused about it. In fact, the Puritans who came to America preferred the Geneva Bible, even though the King James Version was available to them. This image shows the title page of the first edition of the King James Bible, printed in 1611 by Robert Baker in London, England. And so though the King James Version was the central English translation for more than 3 centuries, the gradual shifting of the English language toward modern English, as well as the discovery of ancient texts in Hebrew and ancient texts in Greek, meant that revisions were in order. And so there appeared in the late 1800s the English Revised Version, in 1901 the American Standard Version, and in 1952 the Revised Standard Version. Of course, throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st century, there are many additional translations that have been done. So this gives my conclusion to sort of a sketch of the history of the English Bible, and I hope that's been informative for you as the end of lecture number 4.